A chill swept through the courtyard of Windsor, as history itself seemed to pause. If you are just joining us, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the unfolding events surrounding this extraordinary royal moment. What happened inside those stone walls is something no one expected to witness in their lifetime. After years of carrying the weight of the crown, a father looked at his son and spoke his final words as a monarch, leaving behind not just a throne, but an entire era. This is the emotional and unprecedented moment when the heir stood before the world, struggling to keep his composure as he announced his father's farewell. The day began quietly, with no fanfare, no public procession, and no televised ceremony. Only the sound of wind rattling against the iron gates hinted that something monumental was taking shape inside. Courtiers had spent the night preparing the crimson drawing room, the same room where generations of royal history had unfolded. It was here, under the glow of chandeliers, that a chapter closed. Insiders say the decision was not sudden. It was months in the making, written not in proclamations, but in subtle, unspoken signs that only those closest to the family could truly read. For weeks, the palace had been changing in small but telling ways. Trips once marked on the calendar were quietly cancelled. The usually bustling schedule of late-night briefings grew quieter, replaced by long solitary hours spent in the study. The king's writing desk became a silent witness to his inner shift, its surface covered in handwritten notes and sealed envelopes. To those who paid attention, this was not the rhythm of a man clinging to power. It was the rhythm of someone preparing to let go. Family members began noticing it first. Those who shared private moments with him saw a man who had started looking backward, not forward. There were walks taken alone, moments of reflection in the gardens, and a lingering stillness in rooms where once decisions had echoed. He began passing responsibilities to his son, not through public declarations, but through quiet gestures. A briefing handed over here, a document signed together there. Each small moment was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one that only became visible when the announcement finally came. The night before the world learned the truth, a small group gathered behind closed doors. There were no advisors, no aides, no reporters, just family. The king sat in a crimson chair, his hands folded, his gaze steady. The words he spoke that evening were described by one family member as both heartbreaking and deeply dignified. He did not frame his decision as surrender. Instead, he called it a gift, a chance to ensure the future of the crown would not be burdened by hesitation or decline. He was not giving up. He was passing on. What happened the next morning would become one of the most emotional royal addresses in modern memory. As the great doors opened and cameras clicked, the heir walked slowly toward the lectern. His shoulders carried not only the weight of duty, but the full emotional gravity of what had transpired. His voice shook, his jaw tightened, but he spoke with clarity. He confirmed what many had only whispered about for months. The monarch had chosen to step away, not because of crisis, but because of conviction. Every word of that speech was carefully chosen, but it was not just a statement of fact. It was a son speaking of his father. It was a man acknowledging another man's final act of service. As he shared the final words spoken in private, the emotion was unmistakable. His eyes glistened, his voice wavered for a moment, and for the first time, the world saw the heir not just as a figure of ceremony, but as a son standing in the shadow of a legacy. The power of that moment was not in the grandeur of a coronation or the spectacle of a parade. It was in its silence, in the space between each word, in the way he paused before speaking his father's last private words as king. It was in the knowledge that the crown would endure, but the man who wore it would now step into the quiet. And as that reality settled in, the crowd outside the gates began to understand they were witnessing something that had not happened in generations. This moment was not just about duty. It was about love, about a father trusting his son, about a son carrying his father's legacy forward. It was about the reality that behind the crown and the protocol are human hearts that beat, that break, that feel the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. For years, the world had looked to this family for constancy, On that day, they saw something different. They saw change. The reaction was immediate. As the speech concluded, the courtyard erupted in a hushed stillness. Crowds held candles. Reporters lowered their microphones. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment. This was not the end of a reign-through spectacle. It was the beginning of a new chapter born from a quiet, powerful choice. And at the center of it all stood a son who had just spoken his father's last words as a monarch, and a world that would never forget how it felt to hear them.
Behind the polished statement that shook the world lay a private story that had been unfolding in quiet corners of the palace for months. Those closest to the king had seen the shift long before anyone spoke it aloud. It began subtly, the way these things often do, not with grand declarations but with late-night silences that stretched longer than usual, with once busy rooms growing still, with conversations that lingered not on the future but on the past. It was not a decline marked by spectacle. It was a gentle withdrawal, a man slowly untangling himself from the fabric of the life he had carried for so long. The study became the heart of this quiet change. Once filled with the steady hum of advisors and the shuffle of papers, it grew still after dusk. Those who passed by late at night would notice the faint light from a single lamp and the shadow of a solitary figure hunched over a desk. He would sit for hours, reading through old letters, revisiting speeches, running his fingers along the edges of photographs that captured moments frozen in time. It was not sadness that filled those nights, but reflection. It was the weight of legacy pressing softly against his shoulders, asking him what kind of chapter he wanted to leave behind. Close friends described how he began to retreat from the usual rhythm of public appearances. State visits once etched in ink were quietly erased from calendars. Engagements were postponed. Official gatherings, once bustling with energy, became rarer. When people asked why, the answers were vague, but those who had known him long enough recognized it for what it was. He was beginning to turn inward. There was a sense that he was preparing for something monumental, even if he had not yet spoken it aloud. There was a particular night in late summer when the shift became impossible to ignore. The palace halls were nearly empty, the corridors hushed. One of his most trusted aides found him seated by the window in the study, staring out into the gardens. He did not speak at first. He simply watched the leaves moving in the wind. When he finally turned, he did not speak of duty or schedules or affairs of state. He spoke of time. How it moves quickly, how it catches up with everyone, how even the mightiest titles cannot hold it back. It was in that quiet conversation that those around him began to understand what was coming. As autumn crept closer, the signs multiplied. A private archive was unlocked, and letters written over decades were brought out and reread. Some were answered. Others were burned in the fireplace. He began drafting handwritten notes, each one a personal message meant for someone important in his life. They were not official statements, not parting decrees, but something more intimate. He wanted his words to be remembered not as a ruler speaking to subjects, but as a man speaking to people he cared for. Those closest to him tried to offer reassurance, reminding him that he still had strength, that he could continue, that there was no pressure to step away. But he was not seeking permission. He was finding peace. There was a calm in the way he moved, as if each day was one step closer to a decision already made in his heart. It was not about resignation. It was about choosing the moment before the moment chose him. He wanted to hand over a steady legacy, not a fading one. At the same time, within the family, subtle shifts began. Responsibilities once firmly in his grasp began to pass quietly to his son. At first it was minor. A few briefings attended without him. A signature here, a presence there. But over time, those moments grew larger and more meaningful. Invitations once addressed to him began arriving with his son's name. Meetings with key figures were led not by him but by the heir. It was clear to those paying attention that a new center of gravity was slowly forming. Even his public image began to change. Where once he had appeared front and center at ceremonies, now he often stood slightly back, allowing his son to step forward. It was a visual cue, deliberate and unspoken, signaling to the world that the torch was already being prepared to pass. Those who had spent years studying his gestures understood that he was orchestrating a careful transition, one that would feel natural, not forced. Late at night, In the stillness of the palace, he often walked alone in the gardens. The grounds were familiar to him, filled with decades of memories. Each path held a story, each bench a moment. One witness described watching him pause beneath an old tree he used to visit with his sons when they were young. He stood there for a long time, his hands behind his back, his face lit by the faint glow of the lamps. It was a moment of pure quiet, the kind that comes when a decision has finally settled into a person's bones. When he finally told his closest confidants of his intention, there was no dramatic outburst. No tears. Just stillness. He spoke of legacy, of continuity, of not letting history make the decision for him. He wanted his final act as king to be a choice, not a reaction. It was in that calm clarity that his family began to understand the depth of what he had decided. He was not stepping away because he had to. He was stepping away because he believed it was the right thing to do. By the time the announcement was prepared, those closest to him were no longer surprised. They had watched it build day by day, night by night, in quiet corners and long silences. What the world would see as a sudden, historic moment was, in truth, a story written slowly and carefully over many months. A story not of decline, but of grace. A story of a man who understood that the most powerful act of leadership is sometimes knowing when to let go. The quiet unraveling of responsibility within the family circle revealed a story of deliberate preparation, not sudden upheaval. In the weeks before the historic announcement, the heir's role shifted in ways that only those closest to the palace could fully grasp. Meetings once led by the king now had another voice at the table. Briefings, once handwritten notes for the monarch's eyes alone, began arriving in duplicate. Conversations that once ended with decisions now ended with instructions to involve the heir. The transition was not merely happening in public. It was happening behind every closed door, in every careful handover, in every whispered exchange in the corridors. The family began to understand what was coming long before the world did. The first to notice was the Princess Royal, someone who had always paid close attention to the small details others overlooked. She saw the way he had started to defer certain responsibilities, how he would turn to his son during important discussions and let him answer instead. She saw the change not as weakness but as intentional. This was a man preparing his family, not clinging to authority. Camilla, too, recognized the transformation. Her role had been one of quiet support, standing by him through years of intense public attention. She noticed the longer walks he took alone, the way his gaze lingered on portraits in the hall, the way his tone softened when he spoke about the future. Their conversations became less about plans and more about peace. She did not challenge him, nor did she try to talk him out of it. She simply listened. That silence was its own form of understanding. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that his decision was no longer a matter of if, but when. The heir, however, felt it most directly. It began with small symbolic gestures. An invitation to sit in on key meetings. A personal request to review documents before they were signed. A quiet word in passing, asking for his opinion on matters he had once observed from the outside. At first, he treated it as a show of trust. But over time, the pattern became clear. This was not a temporary shift. This was the slow, deliberate transfer of a lifetime's duty. Inside the palace, moments that might have seemed ordinary carried extraordinary weight. One evening, the heir was handed a folder of documents related to an upcoming ceremony. Normally, this would have been his father's sole responsibility. But this time, the folder came with a simple instruction: you handle this. It was a small sentence, but it carried decades of significance. That night, after everyone had left the room, he sat alone with those papers, fully aware of what it meant. His father was not just trusting him. He was teaching him to stand in his place. There were quiet family dinners that winter that no one outside those walls would ever see. They were not gatherings of pomp or formality. They were intimate, personal, often without aides or officials present. At those tables, conversations drifted between memory and legacy. The king would speak less about what he had done and more about what he hoped would continue. He would recall moments from his early years, reflecting not with regret, but with clarity. He would talk about duty not as a burden, but as a promise to be honored carefully. In those moments, the heir began to feel the crown not as a distant symbol, but as a weight settling gently on his shoulders. The subtle change extended beyond words. During official appearances, the heir was often positioned closer to the center, no longer simply accompanying his father but standing as his equal. The public noticed this shift but could not quite place what it meant. It was deliberate. It was quiet. It was the kind of preparation meant to give the world time to adjust before any official words were spoken. Inside the family, however, the meaning was unmistakable. The crown was already beginning to move, not with a loud proclamation, but with a quiet passing of space. Camilla maintained her own quiet strength during this time. She did not campaign for attention, nor did she seek to shape the narrative. She accepted the decision for what it was. She understood that the man she had stood beside was not stepping away from love or family, but from duty. And she understood, too, that her own place in that story would change. Her acceptance was not dramatic. It was simply steady, the kind of strength that does not need to be spoken aloud. And, ever the guardian of protocol, took on the task of ensuring that when the announcement came, it would be flawless. She began coordinating with those who handled ceremonial matters, quietly making sure every detail was in place. She knew that history would not remember the paperwork or the rehearsals, but it would remember how it looked. It would remember how it felt. She made certain that this moment would be dignified, precise, and worthy of the weight it carried. As the heir stepped further into the center of royal life, he felt a shift within himself too. He began to walk through the halls differently, to speak with more authority, to think not just as a son, but as the one who would soon lead. It was not arrogance. It was readiness. It was the kind of quiet growth that comes not from ambition, but from responsibility placed in your hands by someone you love. Then came the evening when the decision was finally spoken aloud to the family. It happened in the crimson drawing room, a space thick with history. The king sat surrounded by those closest to him. The fire crackled softly. The weight in the room was not fear. It was understanding. He looked at his family, one by one, and said the words that would change everything. He was stepping down. Not out of defeat. Out of choice. Out of trust. Out of love. There were no raised voices, no gasps of surprise. They had all seen it coming. But hearing the words spoken aloud still left a quiet ache in the air. The heir felt a deep mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that his father trusted him with something so immense. Sorrow that a chapter was closing. But it was a decision wrapped in grace. A passing of the torch not with spectacle, but with dignity. And in that moment, the family knew that the world was about to witness history. They had already been living it in silence. Soon, everyone else would too. When the morning of the announcement finally arrived, Windsor Castle seemed to hold its breath. There was no parade, no trumpets, no grand display. Instead, the weight of history rested quietly in the air. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows, pale sunlight spilled across polished floors, and centuries-old portraits watched silently from the walls. Outside, a crisp October wind moved through the gardens. Inside, the heir stood alone for a brief moment before the doors opened, gathering his breath and steadying his voice. This was the moment his father had prepared him for, the moment no amount of training could fully shield him from. The room chosen for the address had been carefully selected, not for spectacle, but for symbolism. It was the same room where private family moments had unfolded for generations, where celebrations and grief had both been carried in silence. A lectern had been placed at the center. No grand banners, no ornate backdrops, just the stark, simple weight of history itself. Before stepping forward, he looked briefly to the side, where a small chair sat empty. His father had sat there the night before when the decision was sealed. Now it stood as a quiet reminder that one era had ended and another was beginning. When the heir began to speak, his voice was clear, but anyone listening closely could hear the tremor beneath it. He was not just a future king addressing the world. He was a son speaking about his father. The words had been prepared carefully, but the emotion behind them could not be rehearsed. He confirmed what the world had only speculated about. His father had made the choice to step away. Not through force, not through necessity, but through a deliberate act of grace. It was a decision that carried the weight of tradition and the softness of love at the same time. He paused often, not for effect, but because the emotion was real. His jaw tightened, his eyes shimmered, but he never faltered. Every sentence felt like it carried a lifetime. He spoke of legacy, of service, of quiet strength that does not demand attention. He spoke of his father not as a distant figure on a throne, but as the man who had guided him, who had carried the crown with dignity, and who, in his final act as monarch, chose to pass it on with quiet hands. It was a speech unlike any other he had ever given, because it came from somewhere deeper than protocol. It came from love. At one point, his voice grew softer, and the room fell utterly silent. This was the moment many would remember most. He repeated the final private words his father had spoken to him the night before. The words themselves were simple, but the way he said them made the entire world understand their power. They were not words of instruction or command. They were words of a father to a son, spoken in the privacy of a fading chapter. They carried gratitude, trust, and a gentle farewell. And as those words filled the room, it was as if time itself slowed to listen. Observers in the room later described the stillness as almost physical, like the air had grown heavier. Every camera clicked, but no one spoke. Reporters lowered their microphones. Staff members who had worked in the palace for decades felt tears in their eyes. This was not just a political transition or a ceremonial announcement. It was a moment of shared humanity, when the weight of history met the rawness of emotion. The heir was standing where so many before him had stood, but his presence was not one of inherited power. It was one of love and loss intertwining in front of the world. As he reached the final part of his speech, his tone shifted slightly. The vulnerability remained, but beneath it grew a quiet strength. He spoke of the future, of duty, of continuity. He reminded everyone that the crown was not a possession but a trust, one that must be carried with humility. He honored his father not by glorifying the past, but by accepting the responsibility of the future. It was the kind of speech that will be studied for years, not because of its grand rhetoric, but because of its honesty. Outside the castle gates, the crowd was massive and hushed. No one chanted. No one pushed. People simply stood, many holding candles, many clutching small flags or photographs. When the words of the speech began to echo through the speakers outside, a quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Some people wept openly. Others held each other's hands. There were no loud cheers or shouts, only the shared understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the day had ended. As the heir stepped back from the lectern, the silence lingered. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply bowed his head for a moment, as if acknowledging both the weight he had inherited and the man who had carried it before him. Those few seconds, unspoken and raw, said more than any official proclamation ever could. It was the image that would dominate front pages across the world, the image of a son in the moment before stepping fully into his father's place. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind the lectern, the empty chair, and the echo of words that would shape the next chapter of the monarchy. The cameras followed, but the real story had already been told. It was not in the grandeur. It was in the pause before each sentence, in the tremor of his voice, in the weight of his father's last words spoken through him. It was in the moment the world saw the heir not as a distant figure, but as a man holding his father's legacy in his heart. That morning, Windsor Castle did not just witness history. It felt it. The world's reaction to the announcement was immediate, powerful, and deeply emotional. Even before the speech had fully ended, word began to ripple through cities, towns, and villages around the globe. Screens lit up with breaking news banners, radio stations interrupted their programming, and people stopped what they were doing to listen. The moment was not just seen. It was felt. For many, it was like the earth itself had shifted slightly, the familiar weight of the crown suddenly resting on a new pair of shoulders. Crowds gathered outside Windsor, not out of curiosity, but reverence. They carried candles, flowers, handwritten letters, and family heirlooms tied to memories of earlier reigns. What unfolded was not a frenzy. It was a vigil. People spoke in hushed tones, as if standing in a cathedral rather than outside palace gates. Some wept openly. Others stood silently, their eyes fixed on the windows, hoping to catch even the faintest glimpse of the family within. Strangers held hands, united not by politics or ceremony, but by the shared understanding that something historic had just happened. News outlets across the world covered the moment with solemnity. Front pages were cleared overnight. Papers ran photographs of the heir at the lectern, his head slightly bowed, his expression caught between grief and resolve. Commentators described it as one of the most human royal addresses in modern memory, one that stripped away layers of formality and revealed something raw beneath. In living rooms and cafes, people replayed the clip of the heir repeating his father's final private words, listening over and over, moved less by what was said than how it was said. Leaders, public figures, and citizens alike shared their reactions. Messages poured in, not just of respect, but of reflection. Many spoke not of crowns or ceremonies, but of fathers and sons, of the weight of time, of how power can be passed not through struggle but through trust. What struck so many people around the world was not the scale of the event, but its intimacy. It felt less like a spectacle and more like a personal farewell that the world had been invited to witness. Inside the family, the atmosphere after the speech was one of quiet gravity. Camilla's reaction had been one of calm acceptance from the very beginning. She had stood quietly to the side, her hands clasped, her gaze steady. She knew her husband's decision better than anyone. She had walked with him through the sleepless nights, the moments of reflection, the weighing of consequences. And now, as the world absorbed the news, she remained composed, not because it did not affect her, but because she had already made peace with it. And moved swiftly but gently, ensuring that every element of protocol flowed as it should. She understood better than most that the way history remembers these moments often depends on the smallest details. The arrangement of the lectern, the timing of the statement, the silence that followed. She had made sure it all unfolded flawlessly, not as an empty display, but as a gesture of respect. Her steady hand ensured that the historic moment was not only powerful, but dignified. Even across the ocean, messages of support came from those who had once felt distant from royal matters. For a rare moment, the global conversation wasn't about scandal, spectacle, or rivalry. It was about legacy, aging, love, and the passage of time. It was about a father stepping back with grace and a son stepping forward with courage. That rare alignment of emotion made the moment transcend borders. It wasn't just a royal family's story anymore. It was everyone's story in some small way. Within the palace walls, the family gathered privately after the speech. The mood was neither celebratory nor mournful. It was reflective. The king, now free of the title that had shaped his life for so long, sat quietly with those he loved. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he carried himself not as someone diminished, but as someone fulfilled. His choice had not been forced upon him. It had been made with clear eyes and a steady heart. That made all the difference. In that private space, far from the cameras and the crowd, the heir approached his father. They did not exchange formalities. There was no grand embrace. Just a quiet look between them. The kind of look only a father and son can truly share when words are no longer needed. It was a moment that would never appear in photographs or official statements, but it was the most real moment of all. Two men, bound by blood and legacy, standing at the invisible line between what was and what will be. As the evening set in, Windsor became a place of stillness. The candles outside continued to burn. People lingered, unwilling to let go of the moment too quickly. Inside, the family remained out of sight, choosing the quiet over any form of spectacle. The king retreated to a smaller sitting room, away from the grand halls, where he could reflect not as a ruler, but as a man. The heir, now the central figure of the institution, did not rush into the spotlight. He simply stayed close to his family, understanding that leadership begins not with a proclamation, but with presence. In the days that followed, the ripples of the announcement continued to spread. Churches held special services. Schools discussed the event in classrooms. Archives pulled photographs of past transitions, placing this one alongside them. But something about this moment felt different. It was not just about the passing of a crown. It was about how it was done. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with resistance, but with grace. This was a rare moment of collective stillness in a world that often moves too fast to feel anything deeply. For one day, millions paused, not because they were commanded to, but because they wanted to. They paused to listen. They paused to feel. They paused to remember what it looks like when history is made not through power, but through humanity. That is why this moment would not fade easily. It had etched itself into hearts, not just headlines. As the world slowly absorbed the magnitude of the announcement, the man at the center of it all quietly stepped away from the spotlight. There was no farewell tour, no ceremonial handover bathed in cameras and applause. After the final words were spoken and the crowd outside Windsor drifted home, the former monarch chose to retreat to a place that had always offered him quiet, away from the pressures that had defined his life. It was a soft exit, almost invisible, a deliberate contrast to the grandeur that had surrounded him for decades. The residence he returned to was nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling fields and ancient trees, far removed from the polished halls of the palace. For years, it had been his sanctuary, the place where he could breathe without an audience. On the evening of his departure, there were no press photographers lined up at the gates. Only a few close members of his family and longtime staff saw him off. The moment was gentle, almost ordinary, but in that simplicity lay its quiet beauty. Those who were with him that evening said he seemed lighter. His steps were unhurried, his shoulders more relaxed than they had been in years. He carried with him no grand speech, no final gesture to the public, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had made a decision entirely on his own terms. The weight of a crown, once carried so carefully, was now resting on another's head. And he was at peace with that. His daily life shifted almost immediately. The endless schedule of briefings and ceremonies was replaced with the calm rhythm of private mornings. He began rising early, walking through the gardens without a security entourage trailing close behind, pausing to watch the mist lift from the fields. He spent hours in his study, but no longer with the burden of state papers. Instead, he returned to personal pursuits, reading, sketching, and reflecting. It was the kind of quiet he had long imagined but never fully experienced until now. The heir, now stepping fully into his new role, did not attempt to overshadow his father's departure with immediate spectacle. Instead, he let the silence breathe. In the weeks that followed, he appeared at select engagements with Catherine, but the tone of their presence was deliberate. It was not about rushing into power. It was about embodying stability. Their appearances were measured, their tone calm. They became the new faces of continuity, not by declaring it, but by living it. The public, too, adjusted to this new chapter with remarkable grace. Many had expected a more ceremonial transition, but the quietness of it seemed to resonate more deeply than anyone had predicted. People spoke less about the event itself and more about how it made them feel. It reminded them that leadership is not only about holding on. Sometimes, it is about knowing when to let go. That idea settled into public consciousness like a whisper carried on the wind, soft but unforgettable. Historians would later describe this transition as one of the most elegant in modern royal memory. There was no scandal, no sudden shock, no fracture. Instead, it unfolded with the same rhythm as a page being turned in a book that everyone has been reading for generations. The story continued, but the narrator changed. The crown passed to new hands without a storm. It passed through love, through trust, through quiet strength. For the family, life entered a new rhythm. Camilla stood by the former monarch in the countryside, their days filled not with protocol but with the gentle routines of ordinary life. They spent afternoons in the garden, evenings by the fire, mornings without cameras. It was a kind of freedom they had never truly known together. For Anne, the tireless guardian of order, the smoothness of the transition was a quiet victory. Her steady presence had helped ensure the dignity of this moment. For the heir and Catherine, the task ahead was immense, but they carried it with measured confidence. They became the new faces of an institution built not on sudden change but on endurance. They knew that the weight they had inherited was not only ceremonial. It was emotional. It was historical. But because it had been passed on so gracefully, it rested on their shoulders a little more gently than it might have otherwise. The legacy of this transition would be remembered not for the words written in official documents, but for the moments that were not captured on camera. A father's quiet walk into retirement. A son standing at a lectern with tears in his eyes. A family gathered in a drawing room as history turned its page. It was not a story of power taken or lost. It was a story of power released with love. In the years to come, people would recall where they were the day they heard the announcement. They would remember the stillness that swept across cities and homes, the way the speech lingered in their minds, the way candles flickered outside Windsor that night. But above all, they would remember the tone of it. The grace. The dignity. The human heart at the center of it all. What began as a private decision in the quiet of a study became a shared moment for millions. The former monarch stepped away, not into obscurity, but into peace. The heir stepped forward, not with noise, but with resolve. And in that passing, a rare kind of legacy was born. A legacy that said leadership is not only about being strong. It is about knowing when to let go with grace. And that, more than anything, is why this moment would live on far beyond the castle walls.